This is an exploratory analysis on the case study of Satyam Computer Limited. The agenda today is to provide an overview of the key issues that arise from the company, the relevant laws, regulations, and policies that apply to these issues, and a comparative approach to the corporate governance standards in Australia. Satyam was founded in 1987 by Ramalinga Raju. Prior to the year 2009, it was one of the few fastest growing companies in India, generating over 2.1 billion revenue and having about 9% of the market share. It had 53,000 employees and operated in 66 countries. It was perhaps one of the first Indian companies to be listed on 3 international exchanges. Ironically, Satyam was presented with the Golden Peacock Award in 2007, which was essentially an award for the best governed company. The scandal was effectively an accounting scam. It was shown that financial statements were manipulated and forged through intentional misapplication of accounting policies. It is not only an example of a bad governance, but also dishonest governance to transfer public funds from the company. It was done by manipulating data and accounts in collusion with the external auditors. So what exactly happened? In a 4.5-page confession letter distributed by Mr. Raju before his resignation, he described it as a small discrepancy that grew beyond his control. What started as a marginal gap between actual operating profit and the one reflected in the books of accounts continued to grow over the years. It has attained unmanageable proportions as the size of the company's operations grew. It was like riding a tiger but not knowing how to get off without being eaten. In this major accounting scam, the independent board members of Satyam, the institutional investors, the regulators and external auditors, none of them with the detailed information available to them, detected the financial irregularities. The key corporate governance issues that arise from Satyam were the lack of transparency in the system, weak independent directors, ineffective whistleblower policy, and short-term performance focused. Especially on the auditor's role, the Satyam fraud went on for a number of years and involved both in manipulation of balance sheets and income statements as mentioned earlier. Whenever Satyam needed more income to meet analysts' expectations, it simply created fictitious sources. Suspiciously, Satyam also paid PwC twice what other firms would charge for the audit, which raises question about whether PwC was complicit in the fraud. Greed for money, power, and competition compelled Mr. Raju to ride the tiger, which led to the violation of all duties imposed on him as fiduciaries. The duty of care, the duty of acting in the best interest of the company, the duty of disclosure towards the stakeholders. This type of behavior can be traced to greed overshadowing the responsibility to meet fiduciary duties, fierce competition and the need to impress stakeholders, low ethical and moral standards by top management, and greater emphasis on short-term performance. As the fraud is exposed, the size and the scope of the fraud raises question about regulatory oversight in India and beyond. The corporate governance practices of India-listed companies are driven by a combination of mandatory requirements and voluntary guideline. At the core, the Companies Act is governing legislation and regulates the constitution of the board, the powers and responsibilities, the rights of the shareholders, annual disclosures, audit and financial statements. The government body with the authority granted by the Companies Act is the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which issues rules and guidelines. Listed companies in India are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Board of India. Specifically on corporate governance, the main regulation is the Listing Obligations and Disclosure Requirement Regulation, which contains a range of substantive requirements on listed companies, including compliance with principles governing the disclosure and obligations of listed companies, the right of shareholders, and the responsibility of the board. Comparatively, 4 of the 8 ASX corporate governance principles and recommendations are identified to be most relevant to the Satyam case. Principle 1 requires a listed entity to clearly delegate the respective roles and responsibilities of its board and management with regular reviews of their performance. Generally speaking, the senior executive team will be responsible for providing the board with accurate, timely, and clear information on the entity's operation to enable the board to perform its responsibilities. In his confession letter, Raju asserted that he and his brother had obtained no financial benefit from the overstated revenues. He also claimed that the other board members were not aware of the true positions of the company. This is highly questionable due to the size and the scale of the fraud. Arguably, the board is in serious misconduct in its role to oversee management, and when required, challenging the management and holding it accountable. Principle 2 requires the board of a listed entity to collectively have the skill, commitment, and knowledge of the entity to enable it to discharge its duties effectively. The unfolding events of Satyam has put the concept of independent directors to serious scrutiny. On the face, Satyam had duly complied with the provisions of the listing requirement. The Satyam board comprised of 11 directors, of which 6 were non-executive directors. 4 of them were academics, 1 former cabinet secretary, and 1 former CEO of a technology company. However, analysts who conducted investigations after the fraud has commented that the conduct of these directors can be described as carelessly negligent, bordering on collusion. Principle 3 requires a listed company to instill and continually reinforce a culture of acting lawfully, ethically, and responsibly. To achieve this, not only that there should be a code of conduct in place for its directors, officers, and employees, the board should also be informed of any material breach. In order for this to succeed, there should be a whistleblower policy which outlines the processes to follow up and investigate reports made under these policy. In relation to Satyam, a fraud to the scale of this size would reasonably be alarming to its employees and directors. As a matter of fact, the fiduciary duties of the directors and its company is well settled. Especially when exercising their power, directors must always bear in mind that they are in a fiduciary position and must exercise their power for the benefit of the company and for that alone. From the above arguments, it is clear that Satyam's board had failed in their fiduciary duties. Principle 4 requires a listed entity to have appropriate processes to verify the integrity of their corporate reports. While the ultimate responsibility for a listed entity's financial statements rests with the full board, having a separate audit committee can be an effective mechanism to bring the transparency and independent judgment needed to oversee the corporate reporting process. As indicated in the previous slide, India's corporate sector is governed by a set of well-structured accounting and auditing provisions for compliance. Despite these rules and regulations in place, the management was able to falsify one of the largest accounting fraud in history. All this was done under PwC, an auditing firm with international credentials, over the period of 7 years undetected. With the role of PwC being suspected, it is not surprising that the internal audit also failed completely. The Indian Corporations Law mandates an elaborate internal control set up through the internal audit framework. These audit committees are vested with powers equivalent to those auditors and can examine all documents, vouchers, as well as question the personnel of the enterprise. Unfortunately, the Satyam tale seems to be a mixture of failure between the internal and external auditors. Satyam rocked the corporate world in India and shown alarming truths about the inadequacies of its corporate governance standards. The government reacted to the fraud by introducing the new Companies Act 2013, which fixed liabilities of auditors and directors in addition to other things. Audit firms now have to be rotated every 10 years beginning April 2017. Auditors have come under intense scrutiny. They have to ensure that every internal financial control prescribed under the Companies Act is followed by a company, among with other things. But are these really enough? Remember that even before Satyam, India's financial reporting standards were relatively thorough. The issue was the weak enforcement and the loopholes in the system. Satyam today is a cautionary tale to companies, auditors, and authorities, but hasn't really improved India's corporate governance standards. In addition to administering the full principles highlighted in the previous slides, thorough enforcement and punitive measures would safeguard integrity needed for an organization to achieve the long-term and sustainable growth.